The day the neighborhood pool failed to open, I was standing about 30 yards away holding a manila folder and trying very hard not to smile. Kids were lined up along the fence with inflatable sharks and pool noodles. Parents were balancing paper plates full of cupcakes, and the board members of Cedar Ridge Community Association were taking turns congratulating themselves over a microphone as if they'd just landed a man on the moon. The only problem was that the pool behind them was completely empty. Not low on water. Not half-filled. Bone dry. A giant concrete bowl sitting under the summer sun like somebody had forgotten the most important step. At first nobody seemed worried. They assumed there had been some minor delay. A pump issue maybe. A scheduling problem. But I knew exactly why there wasn't a single drop of water in that pool, and the reason was sitting inside the folder tucked under my arm. Looking back now, the funny part isn't that they built a pool on my property. The funny part is that I warned them for months before they did it. My name is Ethan Mercer, and for almost 15 years I owned a narrow piece of land on the western edge of Brookhaven Township, a quiet suburb outside Columbus. It wasn't the kind of property people bragged about. No lake view. No fancy house. No development plans. Just a long rectangular parcel of grass and open field that bordered an old service road. I bought it years earlier because I liked the idea of having a little extra space away from people. At the time, nobody wanted that land. Realtors practically laughed when I made the offer. One of them actually asked me, "What are you planning to do with it?" I remember shrugging and saying, "Probably nothing." And for a long time, that's exactly what I did. I kept it clean, paid the taxes, mowed it a few times every summer, and mostly forgot about it. The only improvement I ever made was installing a utility connection and a water access point near the back portion of the property. My father had been a landscaper, and he always believed land should be prepared before you need it. "You'll thank yourself later," he used to say. So I paid for the permits, hired a contractor, and had everything properly installed. At the time it seemed like a boring investment. Years later, it would become the most important thing on that property. For nearly a decade, everything stayed quiet. Then developers arrived. Within a few years, hundreds of houses started appearing around me. Empty fields turned into cul-de-sacs. Construction crews became a daily sight. Eventually, the Cedar Ridge subdivision was born, followed by the HOA that governed it. Now, to be clear, I wasn't part of the HOA. My parcel existed before the subdivision. I wasn't subject to their rules, their fees, or their meetings. That fact bothered certain people more than it probably should have. Most residents didn't care. A few board members definitely did. The first one I really noticed was a woman named Diane Holloway, president of the association. Diane had the kind of confidence that comes from never hearing the word no often enough. Every conversation felt like she was conducting an interview she had already decided the outcome of. About 2 years before everything exploded, she approached me during a neighborhood cleanup event. "You know," she said while looking across my field, "this land would be much more useful if it were integrated into the community." I laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. Integrated how? I asked. Shared recreational space. Walking trails. Amenities. Something that benefits everyone. I remember saying, "It's private property." Her smile tightened slightly. Of course. For now. That should have been my warning sign. Months passed. Then one spring afternoon colorful flyers started showing up in mailboxes all over the subdivision. Residents were excited. Social media groups exploded with comments. The HOA had approved funding for a major community recreation project. The centerpiece would be a brand new swimming pool with lounge areas, shaded seating, and a pavilion for neighborhood events. Most people loved the idea. I probably would have too if I hadn't looked closely at the map. The moment I unfolded that flyer, my stomach dropped. There it was. The proposed pool location. The exact outline matched my parcel almost perfectly. At first I honestly assumed somebody had made a drafting mistake. That seemed far more likely than what was actually happening. So I did the reasonable thing. I sent an email. Then another. I attached survey records. Property tax documents. Boundary maps. Everything was polite. Everything was professional. I figured someone would notice the error and correct it. Days passed. Then weeks. No response. Not even an acknowledgement. Then one morning I drove past my property and saw survey stakes hammered into the ground. Bright orange markers stretched across the field exactly where the future pool was supposed to go. I parked my truck and stared at them for nearly a minute. My first reaction wasn't anger. It was confusion. Surely somebody had missed an email. Surely somebody would realize the mistake before construction started. Then I heard the sound of heavy equipment coming down the road. 3 trucks rolled toward my land, followed by an excavator. Workers climbed out and immediately got to work unloading equipment. That's when a strange feeling settled into my chest. Because for the first time, I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. Somebody had seen the documents. Somebody had ignored them. And somebody had decided to move forward anyway. I got out of my truck and walked straight toward the foreman before anyone could start digging. He was a stocky guy in his 50s named Rick according to the patch on his shirt. And he looked exactly like someone who had spent 30 years working construction sites and wanted absolutely no part of neighborhood politics. "Morning," I said. "Can I ask who authorized this project?" He pointed toward a clipboard without even looking up. "HOA project. Everything's approved." I glanced at the paperwork. Right there under the site description were the words Community Reserve Area. I almost laughed. Community Reserve Area. The county records sitting in my glove compartment would have disagreed with that description pretty aggressively. "This isn't community property," I told him. "It's mine." That finally got his attention. He studied my face for a second. "Then you need to talk to the people who hired us." "Trust me," I said. "I've been trying." That afternoon, I called the county office again. Not because I doubted myself, but because I wanted absolute certainty before things went any further. The woman who reviewed the records sounded confused when I explained the situation. "Mr. Mercer, the parcel is still under your name. No easements." I asked. "None. No transfer. None. No HOA ownership claim? Not according to county records." I thanked her and sat quietly for a few minutes staring out my kitchen window. Sometimes people imagine anger arrives all at once, but for me it came in layers. First confusion, then concern, then disappointment. The anger didn't show up until I realized they had never made a mistake at all. They had simply decided my ownership didn't matter. Over the next several weeks I documented everything. Photos, videos, emails, certified letters. Every time construction crews arrived, I took pictures. Every time another section of my property disappeared under concrete, I updated my records. Friends kept asking why I wasn't hiring a lawyer immediately. The truth was simple. I wanted to understand how far the HOA intended to take this, because part of me still believed someone would eventually come to their senses. Instead, the opposite happened. The deeper they got into the project, the more confident they became. It was almost fascinating to watch. One evening, I attended an HOA meeting held at the community clubhouse. Since I wasn't a member, I wasn't allowed to vote, but I was allowed to speak during public comments. Diane Holloway was seated at the center of the board table, looking pleased with herself. Renderings of the future pool were displayed on easels around the room. Residents applauded every update. When my turn came, I stood up holding copies of my survey documents. "The pool is being constructed on my property," I said. The room immediately grew quieter. Diane smiled politely. "Mr. Mercer, we appreciate your concerns." I hated that phrase the moment she said it. "We appreciate your concerns." It was the corporate version of patting someone on the head. "These aren't concerns," I replied. "These are county records." I held up the documents. "The land belongs to me." Diane folded her hands together. "Our legal review indicates the project is properly authorized. Then your legal review is wrong." A few residents exchanged nervous glances. Others looked annoyed, probably assuming I was trying to delay their new pool. Diane's smile never changed. "Thank you for your comments." And just like that, she moved to the next agenda item. I sat down feeling something shift inside me. That was the moment I stopped trying to convince them. You can't reason with people who benefit from not listening. Construction accelerated after that. Every week another piece of the project appeared. Excavation became foundations. Foundations became walls. Walls became a recognizable swimming pool. Fencing went up. Concrete walkways appeared. Landscapers planted decorative shrubs. If I hadn't known the circumstances, I probably would have admitted it looked nice. That's what made the whole thing so bizarre. The HOA wasn't building some secret project hidden in the woods. They were building a massive public facility in plain sight, while pretending ownership laws didn't exist. The residents, meanwhile, grew increasingly excited. I couldn't even blame most of them. They weren't the villains in this story. They had been told the project was legitimate. They trusted their board. If anything, I felt bad for them. They were about to discover that confidence is not the same thing as competence. Around midsummer, I received a letter from an attorney representing the HOA. The message was surprisingly arrogant. It claimed the association believed it had sufficient authority regarding the property and advised me not to interfere with ongoing construction activities. I read that letter 3 times. Then I laughed so hard I nearly spilled coffee on my kitchen table. Not because it was funny, but because it revealed exactly what they were thinking. They believed momentum had become ownership. They believed that if they built enough of the project, nobody would dare challenge it. Maybe they assumed I couldn't afford a legal fight. Maybe they assumed I'd eventually surrender and accept a settlement. Or maybe they simply convinced themselves they were right. People can justify almost anything when enough money has already been spent. By late August, the pool looked finished. The giant concrete basin gleamed in the sunlight. The pavilion stood completed beside it. Decorative signs advertised the upcoming grand opening. Banners stretched across the entrance announcing a new chapter for Cedar Ridge. Neighbors talked about pool parties. Parents discussed swim lessons. Kids rode bicycles past the site every day asking when it would open. Meanwhile, I kept organizing paperwork and waiting. Because there was one detail nobody seemed to understand. Years earlier, when I installed that utility connection on my property, the contractor had explained something important. Due to the layout of the surrounding land, the water access point controlled supply to that entire section of undeveloped property. At the time, it meant nothing to me. I was just preparing for future irrigation. But after the subdivision expanded around my parcel, that same connection became strategically valuable. Very valuable. One Saturday morning, I decided to review the original utility records. I pulled old permit folders from a storage cabinet in my garage. Dust covered most of them. Some hadn't been opened in over a decade. It took nearly 2 hours before I found what I was looking for. Engineering diagrams. Utility permits. Contractor notes. Then I saw it. A detailed map showing the exact route of the water infrastructure. I spread the pages across my workbench and stared at them. The HOA's new pool connection tied directly into the line running through my property. More importantly, the primary control valve remained inside a metal access box located entirely within my legal boundary. I remember leaning back and just sitting there quietly. Not because I had discovered a loophole. Because I had discovered reality. The pool wasn't functional without my infrastructure. The HOA had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars constructing a facility they literally could not operate without access to my property. The realization felt almost unreal. For months, I had watched them act as though ownership was a technicality. Suddenly, ownership was the only thing that mattered. The following week, I visited the site one final time before opening day. Workers were cleaning the deck area. Furniture was being arranged. Decorative banners fluttered in the breeze. A maintenance contractor was inspecting equipment near the pump room. I walked past the fence and stopped beside the old metal valve box. It looked exactly the same as it had years earlier. Small, unremarkable, easy to ignore. Funny how life works sometimes. The most important thing in the entire project wasn't the giant pool or the expensive pavilion. It was a metal box most people wouldn't notice unless they tripped over it. A young worker nearby nodded toward the pool. "Pretty nice, huh?" he said. I looked at the sparkling new facility. Then I looked down at the valve box. "We'll see," I answered. The night before the grand opening, I reviewed every document one last time. Survey maps, property records, utility permits, county confirmations. Everything was organized neatly inside a folder. Then, just before sunset, I walked out to the access box standing quietly on my land and turned the valve closed. No drama, no speeches, no confrontation, just one simple turn of the handle. Then I locked the box and headed home. The next morning, the residents of Cedar Ridge would gather for the biggest celebration their HOA had ever hosted. They would bring balloons, folding chairs, barbecue trays, and excited children. Diane Holloway would stand in front of the crowd and talk about vision, leadership, and community investment. What nobody knew was that beneath all that confidence sat an empty pool connected to a water line they had never actually owned. Opening day arrived hot and bright. One of those late summer mornings where the air already feels warm before 9 o'clock. I parked across the road and watched residents stream toward the new recreation area carrying towels, folding chairs, coolers, and enough sunscreen to survive a small apocalypse. Kids were practically vibrating with excitement. Parents looked relieved to finally have something nearby that would keep those kids occupied for a few hours. For a moment, I almost felt guilty. Not because of what I had done, but because most of these people had no idea they had been dragged into someone else's bad decision. Around 10 o'clock, the ceremony started. Diane Holloway stepped up to the microphone wearing a bright smile and a brand new Cedar Ridge polo shirt. She thanked volunteers, praised the board's leadership, and talked about building a stronger community. People applauded. Cameras came out. A ribbon was cut. Then everybody turned toward the pool. Nothing happened. At first the crowd seemed confused. A few minutes passed. Then 10. Then 15. I could see maintenance workers moving faster and faster around the equipment room. One man disappeared inside the pump building and came back out looking frustrated. Another grabbed a radio. Diane's smile slowly began to crack. Eventually somebody in the crowd asked the question everyone was thinking. Why isn't there any water? That was when the panic started. Technicians checked pumps. They checked electrical panels. They checked filtration systems. Everything appeared functional. Yet the giant pool remained completely empty. Word spread through the crowd in waves. People started whispering. Parents looked annoyed. Kids looked disappointed. Board members looked nervous. Finally, a contractor began tracing the supply line itself. I watched from a distance as he followed the route across the property. A few minutes later, he stopped at the fence line. Then he looked toward the small metal valve box sitting quietly on my land. Even from where I stood, I could see the expression on his face change. It was the look people get when they suddenly realize the problem is much bigger than they thought. A short time later, Diane and two board members were walking directly toward me. "Mr. Mercer," Diane said, trying very hard to sound calm. "We appear to be experiencing a temporary issue." "Looks that way," I replied. "The water connection is shut off." "Yes." And her jaw tightened. "We need access." I opened the folder I had been carrying all morning and handed her copies of the documents. Survey maps, county ownership records, utility permits, every piece of evidence I had been sending for months. "You had access," I said, "back when I emailed these." For several seconds nobody spoke. Around us, residents were beginning to gather. Some recognized me from earlier meetings. Others were seeing the documents for the first time. Questions started flying. "Wait, that's private property. The pool is on his land. How did this happen?" Diane looked trapped between embarrassment and anger. "This isn't the appropriate place for this discussion." I almost laughed. Actually, this is exactly the place. Because for the first time, the people paying HOA dues were seeing the truth with their own eyes. Not rumors. Not legal arguments. Reality. The pool they had funded sat on land the association didn't own and depended on infrastructure it didn't control. Within an hour, the celebration had completely collapsed. Families left early. Conversations turned heated. Several residents demanded answers from the board. One elderly homeowner actually walked up to Diane and asked, "Did anybody check who owned the property before spending our money?" She didn't have a good answer. The weeks that followed were even uglier. Emergency HOA meetings were scheduled. Attorneys became regular visitors. Residents demanded financial records. The deeper everyone looked, the worse things appeared. Eventually, the association approached me privately. Their tone was very different now. Gone was the confidence. Gone were the dismissive smiles. Suddenly, they wanted to negotiate. One attorney slid a proposal across a conference table and said, "We'd like to find a practical solution." I remember looking at him and thinking how interesting those words sounded after months of being ignored. In the end, the HOA faced two choices: remove the entire project or purchase the land legally. Neither option was cheap. Neither option was popular. And neither option would erase the embarrassment of what had happened. After months of negotiations, legal fees, and angry resident meetings, a settlement was finally reached. The association paid substantially more than the parcel had ever been worth before construction started, covered additional legal costs, and several board members quietly resigned before the following election. Diane was among them. I haven't spoken to her since. Sometimes people ask if I feel vindicated. Honestly, that's not the word I'd use. Vindication sounds dramatic. The truth feels simpler than that. I own something. I proved I owned it. And eventually reality caught up with people who believed confidence was a substitute for permission. What still fascinates me is how easily the whole disaster could have been avoided. One phone call, one meeting, one honest conversation. That's all it would have taken. Instead, pride turned a routine property discussion into a very expensive lesson. Today the pool is operating. Families use it every summer, and most of the residents who enjoy it had nothing to do with the decisions that created the mess. In a strange way, I'm glad the community eventually got something positive out of the situation. But every time I drive past the entrance and see kids splashing around, I can't help remembering that opening day morning, the balloons, the speeches, the applause, and the giant empty pool sitting under the sun, while an entire HOA learned that ownership isn't a suggestion. It's not an inconvenience. It's not a technicality. And no matter how much money you've spent, no matter how many people agree with you, and no matter how close you are to the finish line, building something on someone else's land doesn't magically make it yours. Now I'm curious what you think. Was I right to shut off the water and force the issue publicly, or should I have handled it differently once construction was already complete? If you were one of the homeowners who paid HOA dues for that project, who would you blame most, the board, the attorneys, the contractors, or me for waiting until opening day? Let me know in the comments, because even years later, people still argue about who was really in the right.